Welcome, everyone, to a collaboration between the Journal of Health Communications and the CONVINCE initiative. CONVINCE stands for COVID-19 New Vaccine Information, Communication, and Engagement. I'm Caroline Sheehan, and I'm interviewing authors from the Journal of Health Communications special issue all about communicating and building confidence in the COVID-19 vaccine, and how to apply certain authors' research to the current issues we're facing now that all adults in the US are eligible for the COVID-19 vaccine. Today, I am being joined by Professor Thomas May from Washington State University. Professor May, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell us a little bit about your own background and the research that you published and the commentary that you published in the Journal of Health Communications?
Yeah, my background is in philosophy. I actually have my PhD in philosophy, and I work in the area of bioethics. I work in bioethics really in two areas. One of those areas being genomic research, what are known as LC considerations, that's ethical, legal, and social implications of genomic research. And the other area is in pandemic preparedness and response, which looks at primarily pandemic sort of infectious disease outbreaks like the one we're facing now with COVID-19, but also in areas such as mandatory childhood immunizations and the justification and for the recognition of exemptions to mandatory childhood immunizations for children entering the school system, as well as the limits to those exemptions.
Fascinating and a heavy area in general, and of course, so applicable now. In your article, you talked about anti-vaxxers and how to develop trust among anti-vaxxers, and specifically around reasons for hesitancy and the politicization and ulterior motives of health communication surrounding the COVID-19 vaccine. So when the article was published, and the research you cited was really pulling from 2020 surveys and polls and data. And obviously, things have been changing so rapidly around COVID-19 vaccination. And right now, as we're speaking in April of 2021, everyone is eligible now. Two things have really happened. So in 2020, a lot of the research was a little more theoretical before the vaccines had really come on board. Now vaccines are here. People are seeing their friends get vaccinated, their family get vaccinated. We've also, of course, have seen a change in the presidential administration. And you talked about some research citing concerns or issues with trust around President Trump's administration, and now we have the Biden administration, which of course may increase trust in some communities and decrease trust in other communities. Can you talk a little bit now about the current landscape of vaccine trust and kind of what has changed between then and now?
I'm actually going to answer your question as a philosopher in a bit of a roundabout way, but I promise I will be going to the main point that you when I think the issues that we're facing now with the COVID-19 vaccine hesitancy are really old issues that have been around for decades. When I started working in the area of childhood immunizations, my students often asked me what it was like to invent the wheel, because it was so long ago. But we've actually been working on these very same issues about hesitancy. And we see a sort of common thread running through the decades from back in the 1990s till now. And that is an issue of trust about safety of the vaccines and whether or not people believe the statistical information we have about safety. So you may remember that for childhood immunizations, particularly for the MMR vaccine, the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, there was a paper published in the late 90s in the journal Lancet that purported a link between autism and the administration of the MMR vaccine. Right? That paper was taken by a lot of people to be indicative of the lack of safety for the administration of vaccines. And that lack of safety has motivated an increase or an uptick in vaccine hesitancy. Now, Subsequently, in the early 2000s, it was learned that the data in question, or the data that was used for that paper, was actually fabricated. And so that paper was retracted, and a lot of effort went into putting out the word that that was fabricated data. But of course, it doesn't reach everyone. And it also is the case that some people don't know whether or not to believe the original research, or wonder if the claim that it's fabricated is itself fabricated in order to increase uptake of vaccines, right? And so what we've seen is a slow and steady rise in the number of exemptions that are requested for childhood immunizations, right? And so we see this going on. When I started working in this area, we were talking about the theoretical need to limit exemptions to childhood immunizations and what they may be. But it wasn't yet a problem. There was not yet enough vaccines in any given area to threaten herd immunity, right? And so we were able to maintain herd immunity, which itself creates a statistical dilemma, because what you can end up with is a set of risks, or a comparison of risks, that makes the vaccine look more dangerous than it actually is in comparison to the disease itself. So for example, if you have herd immunity, your risks of actually contracting measles is so low that if you compare the risk of a reaction to the MMR vaccine, however small they are, they look at almost as bad as the risks from measles itself, only because we have achieved herd immunity to measles. If we get a high enough rate of exemption, those statistical comparisons change dramatically, right? So I think a lot of what happens with this slow and steady increase, and you can see that when it reached even the year before COVID, in 2019, there were surveys done looking at the level of public trust of childhood immunizations, and we saw almost half of the population concerned about the safety of childhood immunizations, despite decades of a lot of data that have proven the safety of childhood immunizations. So we can see these things increase, I think primarily because there's a limit to the effectiveness of this data in convincing people if they don't trust the data itself.
Absolutely. You really paint an excellent historical picture that informs our current issues now. And even with the vaccine here, and even with people being able to see people in their community and friends and family get vaccinated with little to no issues, there are remaining those serious concerns about side effects, whether fed on misinformation or fed correctly by current information, shall we say.
And we see, we see this even with the public evaluations of the seriousness of COVID itself. We can see controversies existing in society even there, right? Who do we believe about whether or not COVID is really a serious pandemic? And a lot of these begin to take on a political agenda, and then people begin to suspect that the information and conclusions that are being given by the scientific community are driven by those one side or the other in those political agendas, which becomes problematic, because what source of information do you then trust?
Exactly. And how do we convince people to trust the best information that we have? So that gets to my next question, because you talk about the dangers of having an ulterior motive in communications, and how even if that ulterior motive is very well intentioned, for example, the Surgeon General cautioning people early in the pandemic to not use masks because of the PPE shortage, but seemingly framed as, oh, you don't need a mask, it's okay. That really did affect confidence and trust in mask wearing. And so you caution against having ulterior motives. And then, as you say, there's certain groups within the United States that will ascribe those ulterior motives, whether or not they actually exist. Do you think that there is any way that we can begin to break through with these communities of people, or people who, as you say, begin to think that there is a political side or a deeper motive to communication when we're really trying to communicate as clearly as possible?
It's a very good question. I think that the answer is going to sound initially somewhat pessimistic, but I think is actually optimistic in the long term. I think that if our expectations are that we can break through immediately, I think that we will be disappointed, because I think building this trust takes time. It takes time. It takes giving information that people can see is not driven by political considerations, and sometimes even sacrificing short-term goals for more important long-term goals. And I think one of the examples of that is arising right now in the context of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine pause that we're seeing due to concerns about the potential for blood clots. I should begin by introducing all the caveats that I argue for in the paper. And that is, we have very little data right now about whether or not these clots are actually associated with the vaccine itself. 6 individuals is not very many. And so we do have a lot more work to do to study this. But I think it's good that we are pausing in order to investigate this, given that we have noticed a red flag, right? And I think that you see in the discussion surrounding this pause, a lot of folks arguing that we shouldn't pause because it will only increase vaccine hesitancy and give rise or give legitimacy to concerns about vaccine safety. I think that's precisely the sort of hidden agenda underlying the safety concerns that we have to avoid. We have to pursue safety for its own sake, not safety in order to increase uptake, because then it will be suspected that we will only give the safety information that's consistent with vaccine uptake. It reminds me of a philosopher, John Stuart Mill, who in his autobiography described happiness and argued that we rarely are able to attain happiness, if ever, if we pursue it directly as our end. We should pursue some other end, and happiness will be attained along the way, right? So if you're trying to be happy, it's hard to actually attain happiness. But if you're pursuing those things that make you happy for their own sake, happiness will result. And I think a similar idea applies here. If we're pursuing the evaluation of safety on the basis of learning whether or not the vaccine is safe, uptake will follow from that, not because we've pursued safety in order to increase uptake, but because increasing uptake requires that the public see us as pursuing the evaluation of safety for its own sake. I hope that makes sense.
It makes complete sense, and it's a really interesting way to frame the situation. And I like that quote that you used as a comparison. I also wonder how you would respond then to people who might raise ethical concerns about the fact that we've paused the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. How many people are now going unvaccinated either during the pause or potentially because of hesitancy, which may result in increased infections and lives lost?
Yeah. I think the first thing that we have to realize is that, again, we can't allow the desire to vaccinate everyone to drive our safety evaluations. So we have to separate those first and foremost. But I also think it's really questionable whether or not we're seeing a tremendously meaningful decrease in vaccination, because from what I'm seeing, at least in news reports, we can only get our information from people on the ground that are reporting right now, right? The challenge right now in vaccinating, at least in the United States, is not so much the number of vaccine doses available. It's convincing people to actually uptake them, or at least they're at least equal. So I think that this has to be balanced, right? It's intuitive to say that if we pause the Johnson and Johnson vaccine doses, that we won't have enough to vaccinate everyone immediately, but we have a lot of doses available of the two mRNA vaccines. And, we can work toward doing that and increase uptake over the course of the vaccination program by assuring the public that we are evaluating the safety of these vaccines on its own merit and not in the context of increasing uptake.
As you say, playing the long game rather
Yeah.
than going for the short-term win.
We want to see, we don't want to increase short-term vaccinations by a few thousand or even a couple of million, only to see many millions refuse to uptake the vaccine at all at the end of the summer, for example, right? Mm-hmm. We would rather be cautious and safe and have higher percentages overall vaccinated when this program is complete.
So speaking of being cautious, you also talked in your article about the importance of being cautious in our framing of scientific results on the part of both scientists and journalists, right? The scientists sometimes have this risk of overinflating the results of their study, or journalists run the risk of misinterpreting the statistics or otherwise not necessarily appending the necessary cautions and discussing the limitations of particular studies, especially now in the context of rapid research, which you discussed, and how many articles are going into preprint and how many articles and other research may or may not be retracted. What is your advice to anyone, really, whether it's journalists or scientists or lay people who are communicating about COVID-19 vaccine information and research, to be able to frame everything correctly and be as accurate as possible?
That's a very good question. I think it takes a lot of work on the part of both parties. I think both journalists as well as scientists have to become more aware of the communication jargon and conventions of the other discipline, right? And to properly frame the description of the conclusions being drawn by the scientific results in question. Perhaps the journalist could, sort of check on, am I saying the right thing here about what your research can conclude? And scientists being aware that a lot of subtle caveats that carry great meaning within their discipline may sort of be glossed over by the general public or even journalists who aren't familiar with that emphasis being placed on the caveat. I'll give you a very quick example. I'm seeing recently a lot of newspaper stories about the Pfizer studies concerning and Moderna studies concerning how long the vaccine is effective. And we know that we're now we're at the 6-month point, so we can evaluate it at 6 months. And so you see some stories that correctly frame this as the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are effective for at least 6 months, right? And that's the information that we can draw right now. But I've also seen stories that actually explicitly say that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are only effective for 6 months, which is not the conclusion to draw. We can't say whether it's effective beyond 6 months because we have to wait until we're at those time points to evaluate the effectiveness, right? So that's a very important difference. And, I think that some journalists will find it tempting to say those vaccines are only good for 6 months because it draws attention, right? We know that that this is one of the truths of journalism, right? But it's also misleading. It's true that we can't say that it's effective beyond 6 months, but we also don't know that it's not effective beyond 6 months. We only can evaluate it up to the time point that we now stand at. And that's an example of the importance of properly framing the conclusions of the data and the scientific evaluation that's taking place.
Absolutely. And then you think of all the readers who are seeing these incorrect headlines, and it's amazing the difference that only a couple of words can make that could really impact trust. And people may start to think, again, going back to the ulterior motives, if it's only effective for only 6 months, is this all a ploy by a pharmaceutical company to get more shots and make more money? Which we know it's not. We know this is just the limitation of evidence. In conclusion, are there any other health communication strategies that you would like to see more people, whether it is officials in health departments, whether it's scientists, or whether it's just lay people communicating with friends and family about the vaccine?
Yeah. Well, I think it's important to remember that all science is based upon making inferences, which are, we look at statistical correlations, right? We draw conclusions about the likelihood of this relationship between this event and that event, right? But none of these are set in stone. So when we think about things, we need to realize that these are statistical correlations, right, in most cases, and we're looking at probabilities, right? And some of those probabilities we are very confident about, and some of them we are less confident about. But in all of these cases, when we're talking about probabilities, the fact that we don't know it with 100% certainty should not be damning, if you will, for the correlation in question, because that is the nature of science. We're looking at probabilities. When we get evidence to the contrary, we acknowledge that and try to account for it. That's the scientific process, right? And so we have to understand the limitations of conclusions being drawn and accept them and realize that that is how life is, and it doesn't mean that we can't rely on this information at all.
Absolutely. I think that is great advice to close with, not only for communicating about the COVID-19 vaccine, but for communicating about any scientific advancement or any kind of research. So, Professor May, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you again for having me.